Hello, what time is it where you are right now? Type the hour in the comments.
They say you learn the truth about your family not during birthdays or weddings or graduations, but during moments that are raw, inconvenient, and ugly, the ones where you're in pain and you need help. The kind you can't just Google or push through with ibuprofen and a fake smile. For me, that moment came lying in a hospital bed with a thin blanket, a barely working morphine drip, and a discharge paper that said I owed just over $8,000 for an emergency gallbladder removal. No one sat in the chair beside me. No one brought flowers. The only people who had my emergency contact were my parents, Martin and Susan Walker. But even the nurse said, I think they sent it to voicemail. I didn't panic at first. I thought, maybe they're stuck in traffic. Maybe Dad's phone is on silent again like it always is. But as the hours passed and no one came, I started piecing together a different kind of reality. It wasn't just today. It was always. The last-minute cancels, the "we're so busy, sweetheart" texts, the holidays I always hosted because you're so good at organizing, Em. When I finally called them the next morning, Susan answered with that clipped, performative warmth she uses with friends at the country club. Only it felt even colder over the phone. Oh, honey, we figured you'd want to rest. Hospitals aren't exactly social places, right? I didn't even respond to that. I just told her what the nurse told me, that I'd be discharged in a few hours, that I'd need someone to drive me home, and that I'd be out of work for a couple weeks, maybe more. The part I was most afraid to say came last. I don't really have the money for all of it, Mom. The insurance only covered part of it, and I've still got rent, and that's when she cut me off. Emily, sweetheart, you're not a child anymore. You're 42 years old. I know it's hard, but you've got to figure these things out. That's what being an adult is. I remember sitting in silence for what felt like a year. I stared at the IV in my arm, then at the clock, then back to the phone like I might have misheard her. But no, I heard her just fine. She sounded almost rehearsed, like she'd said this line before to someone who didn't matter. I wanted to say something clever, something biting, something that would make her regret that line for the rest of her perfectly organized suburban life. But I didn't. I just said, okay, thanks, and hung up. The nurse wheeled me to the front, and I ordered an Uber with the last $70 on my card. I tipped the driver $0 and still felt guilty about it. When I got home, my cat meowed at me like she'd been waiting to yell, and I sat on the floor and cried with a heating pad on my side and a bank account that looked like a countdown clock to eviction. I didn't text my mom. I didn't call my dad. I swallowed the bitterness like it was another round of antibiotics. But a week later, I saw something that didn't just sting. It lit something in me I didn't know was there. Zach, my younger brother, the golden boy, the one who always struggled with burnout but somehow never had to worry about rent or car payments, posted a carousel of photos on Instagram. There were champagne glasses, shiny lake water, a fireplace with our parents' initials carved into the wood, and in the final photo, a caption that made my stomach drop like a stone in water. Big thanks to Mom and Dad for the vacation cabin. You guys are the best. I really needed a place to chill. Love you. I stared at those words for a long time, scrolling back and forth like maybe I was misinterpreting them. But no, it was real. While I was begging for help to stay afloat, recovering from surgery, and trying not to drown in bills, my parents were buying Zach a second home so he could relax. I didn't need to call and confirm it. I already knew what they'd say. Oh, it's not the same. Zach's had such a hard time with his startup. We wanted to help him unwind. That night, I deleted the Thanksgiving group chat from my phone. I didn't text them. I didn't say a word. I just took my name off the RSVP list and didn't look back. They didn't notice until the day before. Susan left a voicemail that sounded confused but not concerned, like she'd misplaced a set of earrings, not a daughter. I played it once and then again, just to let it sink in how casually they dismissed me from their emotional budget. And here's where I'll ask you something I didn't ask anyone else, because maybe you've been there too. Have you ever realized your family doesn't actually love you the way you thought they did? Not hate, not dislike, but they just don't love you in the way that means anything real? It's not loud. It's not a big betrayal. It's quieter than that. It's not showing up. It's choosing someone else over you with a smile. It's saying, "You're an adult. Figure it out." And then handing your sibling the very safety net you begged for. I didn't want revenge at first. I didn't want drama, but something inside me cracked. Not like a scream, but like a match being struck. And once I saw the flame, I wasn't going to pretend it wasn't there. Not anymore. Thanksgiving was just the beginning. The days that followed my quiet decision to step back from Thanksgiving weren't loud or dramatic, but they pulsed with a quiet storm that refused to go away, like a migraine blooming behind your eyes in a room full of smiling people. I didn't answer calls, didn't explain, didn't justify. I simply let the silence speak for me, because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the most calculated scream you can make. My parents, always so used to being the ones who set the tone of every conversation, didn't know what to do with that silence. And as much as they liked to pretend they lived in some orderly, polite version of reality where everyone just does what's expected, I knew my absence would gnaw at them far more than my presence ever had. It was Claire who noticed the listing first. She's my best friend, and also the kind of woman who doesn't take no from people who are used to never being questioned. She was scrolling through property listings, hunting for a fixer-upper to flip, when she found something that made her stop mid-sentence during our Friday wine call. "Wait a second," she said, tilting her phone to show me the Zillow page. "This address, this is the one your brother posted about, right? The lake cabin?" I didn't recognize it immediately, but when she zoomed in and showed me the photo of the stone chimney with our parents' initials etched in the wood, I felt the same punch I'd felt scrolling through Zach's Instagram. Only this time, I noticed something different. Below the price tag, an almost laughable six-figure number for a waterfront retreat, there was a small line in the Public Records tab. Purchased via the Walker Family Trust. Beneficiary, Zachary Walker. It hit like cold water down the back. Not only had they bought him a property while I was drowning in medical bills, but they used a trust I hadn't heard mentioned in over a decade. Something Dad had once referenced vaguely when I was 29, during a brunch where I'd asked just once if there was any family savings for emergencies. He'd brushed me off then, said it was locked up for retirement planning, and that I should learn to rely on myself. I hadn't brought it up again. Now here it was in black and white, the truth I hadn't wanted to admit. They hadn't helped me because they didn't want to. It wasn't about resources. It was about choice. I didn't qualify for their version of help because I didn't fit the image they wanted to see succeed. I wasn't shiny enough, smooth enough, likable enough, and unlike Zach, I didn't know how to keep things pretty and easy. I came with baggage, divorce, debt, health issues, questions. And in our family, being complicated meant being inconvenient. Claire leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching me process. "So let me get this straight," she said. "You asked for $8,000 to help keep your liver from exploding, and they said no, but they gifted Zach a whole-ass cabin using a family trust you were probably supposed to be part of?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, because if I did, the words would come out cracked and furious. That night, I went back through every document I'd ever received from my parents. Birthday cards, graduation notes, even the awkwardly legal-looking financial overview Dad had emailed me back when I first moved out. I remembered that file, mostly because it had felt more like a corporate offboarding than a parental gesture. It was titled, in all caps, "Emily, for your records." I'd never really read it closely, not until now. But this time I opened every page, every tab, and deep in the PDF, there it was, a section labeled Trust Considerations. And in that section, a clause that made my breath stick in my chest like glue. Beneficiary disbursement scheduled upon reaching age 35, contingent on life stability metrics. Whatever the hell that meant. I was 42 now. I had passed 35 7 years ago. No one had ever mentioned this. Not once. No conversation, no payout, not even a passing by the way. Instead, I'd gone through a divorce, lost a job, gotten sick, and had to take out credit card loans just to get through a month. And through it all, they'd stayed silent, which meant one of two things. Either they had forgotten, which I didn't believe for a second, or they had deliberately chosen to withhold it, rewriting the definition of life stability until I didn't qualify. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the slow dawning awareness that my parents had made a system where love and loyalty came with a performance rubric. And I'd failed the test, quietly, without ever knowing what the rules were. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of reheated coffee and an open laptop, rereading every word of that PDF, every clause of that trust, memorizing the language so I wouldn't ever be caught unaware again. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power. This was about being told for decades that I was too much, too emotional, too dramatic, too independent, and realizing, maybe for the first time, that all of that was designed to keep me small. Zach had texted me twice that week. Once a photo of the cabin's new fireplace set, another just a, "Hey, hope you're okay, Mom says you're mad." I didn't answer. I was done explaining myself to people who only ever saw me as a problem to manage. But even as I stayed quiet, something inside me was shifting. Not just anger, something sharper, something colder. I didn't want to yell or fight or send a dramatic letter. No, I wanted something else entirely. Reckoning. Not the messy, tear-streaked kind, but the precise kind. The kind that cuts through the noise with a scalpel. And I was just getting started. There's a certain kind of betrayal that doesn't scream, doesn't slap you across the face, doesn't even show up with a knife in the back, because it's slower, more calculated, and somehow colder than all of that. It sits with you in the quiet moments when you're washing dishes or folding laundry or pretending to listen during a Zoom call, whispering in your ear that you weren't just forgotten or ignored, but deliberately excluded. That was the flavor of betrayal I was choking on when I decided, against every instinct that told me to let it go, to confront Zach. Not because I thought I'd get the truth, but because sometimes you need to hear the lie out loud to believe how deep the delusion runs. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't storm into his place or show up at the cabin unannounced, like something out of a bad soap opera. I just called him, something I hadn't done in months, and asked if he had time to grab coffee. He sounded surprised, but agreeable. That was always Zach's thing. Agreeable, smooth, that kind of passive charm that makes people trust him even when he's full of shit. We met at a little place he liked near the lake, all reclaimed wood and overpriced cold brew. And when I sat down across from him, I noticed something that stopped me for a second. He looked tired. Not in a dramatic movie star way, but like someone who'd been carrying a weight he didn't quite understand. We made small talk for a few minutes, the kind you do when you're circling something much bigger. He asked how I was feeling post-surgery, and I told him the truth, that recovery was slow, expensive, and lonely. He nodded, made a sympathetic noise, and then went back to sipping his coffee like he wasn't sitting across from the sister whose medical debt could have been cleared by skipping one furniture delivery to his new cabin. I finally leaned in and asked, with as much control as I could muster, "Did you know Mom and Dad used the family trust to buy your place?" He blinked. "Yeah, they mentioned something about that. Said it was easier that way with the taxes or something." "Did you know there was a clause in that trust? One that was supposed to give me a disbursement at 35? He frowned, defensive now. "No, I didn't know that." And honestly, Em, if it was supposed to happen and it didn't, maybe it's because of how things have been. You've had a rough few years, maybe they thought it wouldn't help. That was the moment. That exact sentence, said with that familiar, practiced empathy that sounded supportive but was actually dismissive, that pushed something inside me into a new gear. He didn't even realize what he was saying. To him, my pain wasn't enough. My struggle wasn't real, because he'd never had to convince anyone he was worthy of love, of help, of being believed. "Let me ask you something, Zach," I said, careful, deliberate. "If I were the one who needed to relax, and you were the one who needed surgery, who do you think they'd have helped?" He didn't answer right away. He didn't have to. His silence was the answer, as clear as any word could be. The thing about golden children is they don't always know they're golden. Sometimes they think they've earned it, that they've just made better choices, worked harder, been more agreeable. They don't see the scaffolding that's been built around them since birth, the excuses, the resources, the safety nets. And when you start pointing it out, they panic. Because if they admit it's real, they have to admit they didn't get where they are alone. Zach leaned back, frustrated now. Look, if this is about money, I'll give you something. I didn't know you were in that kind of trouble. It's not about money anymore, I said, and I meant it. It's about being lied to. It's about being told I didn't qualify for help when that was never true. It's about watching you get gifts for being tired while I had to crowdfund my medical bills. He looked genuinely uncomfortable then, not because he disagreed, but because for the first time, he couldn't argue. And he hated that feeling, being pinned to the truth. After that coffee, I didn't go home and cry. I didn't spiral. I went back to my apartment, opened my laptop, and started putting together a different kind of plan. Not a legal one, not yet. That would come later, but something sharper. I went into my old email folders, the ones I rarely touched, and found the string of messages my dad had sent me years ago when he explained the family finances. I read every line, every offhanded dismissal, every subtle jab about my spending habits and lifestyle choices. Then I took screenshots, saved them into a folder labeled "Just in Case," and began working on something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine in years: taking back control. Claire helped me draft a letter, simple, clean, and brutal, not a demand, not a plea, but a mirror. I printed it, folded it, and tucked it into an envelope alongside a photo of myself at 10 years old. The last time I remembered my parents looking at me like I was their pride and joy. It was a beach picture, me standing between them, sunburned and squinting, with sand in my hair and my arm around my little brother. We looked like a family then, before the sorting began, before the hierarchy hardened, before I knew that love could be conditional. On the back of the photo, I wrote just one sentence: "Thanks for teaching me the truth." I didn't send it yet. I wasn't ready, but I knew what came next. I wasn't going to scream at the dinner table or make a scene. I was going to show them what absence really meant. What it feels like when the one person who always bent to keep the peace stops bending. And they weren't going to like the quiet. Not one bit. Thanksgiving morning came wrapped in the kind of weather that makes nostalgia feel like a bruise. Bright, cold, with just enough wind to rustle the dead leaves along the sidewalks, each gust whispering reminders of years past, of tables set with fine china, of dry turkey and forced laughter, of polite arguments over politics that never meant anything because, at the end of the day, everything still revolved around them. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't dressing up to go to my parents' house, wasn't dreading the drive, the small talk, or the way I always left feeling smaller than when I arrived. Instead, I stayed in my apartment, which still smelled faintly of antiseptic from my recent cleaning binge, and watched the hours pass without a trace of guilt or longing. I was exactly where I needed to be. The first text from Susan came at 8 in the morning, cheerful and oblivious, a perfect performance piece. "Happy Thanksgiving. Hope you're feeling better. We've got your favorite pecan pie waiting." The tone, as always, carried that carefully disguised undertone of maternal guilt, sweet on the outside, weaponized underneath. I didn't respond. 2 hours later, she followed up with a voice message, a 60-second monologue of concern, mixed with confusion, pretending as if this silence was new, as if I hadn't been slowly backing away for years. I listened to the message twice, not because I needed to hear it again, but because there was a moment near the end where her voice cracked. Not from sadness, but from the strain of losing control. My absence wasn't just unexpected, it was unacceptable, because for people like my mother, image is everything, and I had just cracked her perfect holiday portrait by refusing to play the part of the grateful, well-behaved daughter. She didn't know what to do with the empty seat, and for once, that was exactly the point. Meanwhile, Zach, ever the peacemaker in appearance if not in substance, sent me a text that felt more like a compliance check than a genuine attempt at connection. "Mom's worried. Can you just let her know you're okay?" I stared at it for a while, feeling the old pull to reassure, to explain, to soften the blow. But I didn't owe them that anymore. Not after what I'd uncovered. Not after the gaslighting, the financial manipulation, the years of subtle punishments for not being the kind of daughter who smiled and stayed quiet. So instead of answering, I did something I hadn't planned but had been toying with for weeks. I logged into the secure app that Claire's investigator friend had set up for me, the one that gave me limited access to a discreet feed of exterior cameras on the property my parents had gifted to Zach. When I first asked Claire to set that up, it was half a joke, half a dare. I didn't think we'd actually pull it off. But the property was still technically part of the trust for a brief period, and the security system had been installed while the paperwork was still under the Walker name. With a little digging and a small fee, we had a window, temporary but effective. And now, on Thanksgiving Day, I watched from my kitchen table as my parents, Zach, and a few family friends gathered outside the cabin, wine glasses in hand, performing their version of unity for whatever unseen audience they imagined applauding their lives. I watched Susan hover near the outdoor dining setup, rearranging silverware with that obsessive grace she always saved for guests, while Martin stood stiffly near the grill, looking more like an intern than the head of the household. Zach laughed too loudly, gesturing with a bottle of Chardonnay, already tipsy or pretending to be. It all looked so polished, so practiced, and underneath it all, so hollow. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see enough. The glances they exchanged. The occasional glance toward the empty chair at the end of the table, the way Susan clutched her phone like it held a ticking bomb. She was unraveling. I knew that posture well. It was the same one she used to wear whenever I refused to wear a dress to church or asked too many questions during dinner. Only this time, there was no way to spin it. My absence was visible, real, and worst of all, unmanageable. And that's when I did it. I opened my laptop, pulled up my email, and drafted a message I'd been writing in my head for weeks. Subject line, adulting. No salutation, no preamble, just the raw sentence they needed to hear. Don't worry about Christmas either. You've taught me how to handle things on my own. I hovered over the send button for less than a second before clicking it. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a statement of anger. It was a declaration of truth, and one that I hoped would echo through their holiday season like a car alarm in the middle of the night. Persistent, inconvenient, impossible to ignore. Later that evening, as I curled up on my couch with a cheap bottle of wine and a microwave dinner, I thought about what revenge really means. People assume it's about shouting, about big gestures and public declarations, but sometimes it's just a decision to stop participating in the illusion, to remove yourself from the narrative that's been written for you without your consent, to leave the stage in the middle of the play and let the actors scramble for their lines. They could keep the pie. They could keep the silverware and the family stories rewritten to exclude the parts that made them uncomfortable. I didn't need their apologies or their explanations. I had something better. I had the empty seat. And it wasn't mine anymore. There's a strange silence that settles over your life after you make a decision so final it rearranges the ground beneath your feet. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace or comfort, but something heavier, denser, like the silence inside a church after someone confesses something awful and holy in the same breath. That's what the days after Thanksgiving felt like. It wasn't joy or satisfaction I felt as the texts trickled in and the family group chat went from half-hearted recipes and photo shares to a quiet void of unspoken tension. It was clarity, the kind that arrives not with fanfare, but with the dead calm of someone who's done explaining themselves to people who never listened in the first place. I didn't expect a full-blown apology. That's not how people like my parents operate. Apologies require acknowledgement, vulnerability, a kind of emotional honesty they treat like a virus, something to be avoided at all costs in favor of politeness and deflection. What I got instead were attempts at patchwork reconciliation, vague messages from Zach asking if we could catch up and clear the air, as if the air hadn't been thick with unspoken favoritism. For decades, a forwarded article from my mother about healing family rifts, a passive-aggressive attempt at peace that came without so much as a real sentence of ownership. And from my father, the quietest of all, a single email with no subject line and no body, just a link to a YouTube video about financial literacy, as if my problems had stemmed from a lack of budgeting skills, rather than a calculated erasure of my right to the very resources he handed over to my brother like a birthday card. I didn't respond to any of it, not because I wanted to be cruel or dramatic, but because at some point you realize that engaging with someone who refuses to meet you where the truth lives is a form of self-betrayal, and I was done betraying myself to make other people comfortable. Claire, who had been my co-conspirator and therapist by default throughout this whole unraveling, invited me to spend Christmas at her place with her sister's chaotic but oddly healing family, people who laughed too loud, drank too much boxed wine, and argued about stupid things like whose turn it was to do the dishes, and somehow made it feel like a kind of belonging I hadn't experienced since childhood. On the afternoon of December 23rd, just before I left town for Claire's, I got a call from Zach. I wasn't going to answer, but something in me, curiosity maybe, or a final flicker of whatever was left between us, pushed my thumb toward the green button. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of tone you use when you've rehearsed a conversation and still know you're not in control of it. Can we talk, like actually talk, he said, his words heavy with the weight of a man who'd realized his family wasn't as clean and noble as he'd grown up believing. I agreed to meet him at a diner halfway between our places, a neutral ground that smelled like burnt coffee and reheated soup, the kind of place where big truths can hide under the hum of an old jukebox and the clink of silverware. He looked rough, less put together than usual, like someone who'd started seeing himself in the mirror without the family narrative to shield him. He didn't waste time. I asked Mom about the trust. She said it was a misunderstanding, that it wasn't personal. I didn't say anything. I just let him sit in that space, let him feel how shallow those words sounded now that the curtain had been pulled back. I didn't know about your clause, he continued, his voice quieter. But I also didn't ask. I just took what they gave me. That's the difference, I said finally, my voice low and steady. You never had to ask. And I was taught that asking was already too much. He swallowed, the kind of swallow that holds back either guilt or anger, maybe both. Do you hate me? The question hung in the air between us, not like a dagger, but like an open wound. No, I said, and I meant it. But I stopped excusing you. There's a difference. We sat in silence for a few more minutes, sipping bad coffee and staring at the window, where the snow had started to fall in slow, lazy flakes. I could tell he wanted more, some kind of resolution, some warm ending where we hugged and decided to move forward. But I didn't offer it, not because I wanted to punish him, but because not every rift deserves a bridge. Some distances are necessary, even sacred. When I left the diner, I didn't look back. I walked to my car feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph, not revenge, but something cleaner, quieter, the full ownership of my own story. And that story, for once, wasn't about being the one who held it all together. It wasn't about proving my worth or begging for inclusion. It was about stepping away from a table where the rules had always been rigged and setting my own instead, even if it only seated one. On Christmas morning, I sat on the porch of Claire's sister's lake house, wrapped in a mismatched quilt with a mug of strong coffee, watching their kids throw snowballs and make terrible snowmen. The chaos was real, unpolished, loud, and it was beautiful. It was human. It was the kind of family I used to dream of but never believed I'd find. And here's the thing I never expected. I didn't miss them. Not the curated warmth, not the performance of unity, not even the familiar rituals of holidays past. What I felt was space, breathing room. The quiet certainty that I had chosen something better than peace. I had chosen honesty. I don't know what happens next. Maybe they'll keep reaching out. Maybe they'll stop trying. Maybe they'll rewrite the story again and cast me as the bitter one, the ungrateful one, the daughter who walked away from everything. But I know this much. I didn't walk away from everything. I walked away from pretending. And that's the best kind of revenge. One that doesn't scream or burn bridges with fireworks, but one that simply walks out the door, locks it behind, and never looks back. So I'll leave you with this. Would you walk away from your own family if they showed you who they really were? Because I did, and I'm not sorry.